Welcome to Creative Imperfections. I'm Kelly, and I am so glad you're here. Think of this podcast as your safe place to be your beautifully messy self. Let's dive in. Today, I have something really specific that I want to talk about. There is a very specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much. It actually comes from being too much for too long. And honestly, I am feeling that in a very real way, coming off of a long weekend at VO Atlanta where my days stretched into 14-hour marathons of constant connection, conversation, teaching, listening, learning, and showing up fully in every single moment. And here's the thing. I genuinely love it because being surrounded by creatives, sharing the same space, energy, and ideas is one of the most fulfilling parts of what I do. But there's also a reality underneath that experience that doesn't get talked about enough, which is how much it takes to be on for that long. Because when I say on, I don't mean fake or inauthentic. I mean stepping into a version of myself that is polished, present, aware, and holding space not just for conversations, but for expectations, for leadership, for the role that I carry into those rooms, especially when I'm speaking, teaching, or just representing my company, where there isn't really room to unravel or second guess or check out, even for a moment. That version of me is real. She's not a mask. She's not something I'm pretending to be. She is absolutely a part of who I am. But she is a heightened, intentional, externally focused version of me. And maintaining that level of awareness and presence for hours on end, day after day, requires a kind of energy that goes far beyond just physical stamina. At the same time, there's another version of me that exists just as truthfully. And she's quieter, more relaxed, less filtered, less concerned with how something lands, and more interested in simply being rather than performing. And she doesn't have a wall up. She doesn't need to be on. She just gets to exist. And I think if you're a creative, especially one who is putting yourself out there in any kind of public or professional way, you know this dynamic intimately. Because we all move between these versions of ourselves, the ones that show up for the room and the one that comes home after. Neither one is more real than the other, and that's important to understand because I think sometimes we start to question ourselves and wonder if being on means we're somehow being inauthentic, when in reality it just means we're accessing a version of ourselves that's equipped for that moment, that environment, that responsibility. The challenge comes when we don't give ourselves permission to step out of it. Because when that switch doesn't flip back, when we stay in that heightened state of awareness and output, even after the event or the experience is over, that's when the exhaustion really sets in. It's not just physical, it's mental, emotional, and honestly, it can feel like a kind of disconnection from yourself. You get home, the noise fades, the conversations stop, the energy shifts, and instead of immediately feeling relief, there can be this strange drop, like your system doesn't quite know what to do with the quiet. And you're left sitting there wondering who you are when you're not actively showing up for everyone else. That's the moment where recovery actually begins. And it's also the moment most people, like myself, skip over because the instinct is to keep going, to process the experience, to turn it into something productive, to answer emails, to follow up, to capitalize on that momentum, and to stay in motion. But what your system actually needs in that moment isn't more output. It's integration. It's the space to come back to baseline, to let your nervous system settle, to reconnect with the version of you that doesn't need to perform or deliver or be anything for anyone else. And that starts with something very simple, but not always easy, which is intentionally lowering the volume in your life for a little while. Whether that means choosing silence instead of more input, or doing something that has no audience, no expectation, no outcome attached to it. Maybe that looks like going for a walk without your phone or sitting outside and letting your mind wander, or even just allowing yourself to do nothing without feeling like you need to justify it. Because after days of being on, your system needs that contrast in order to recalibrate. Another important part of this is checking back in with yourself in a way that isn't filtered through productivity or expectation, and instead asking a much simpler question. What do I actually need right now? Not what should I do next, not what would be impressive, not what would move the needle, but what would help me feel like myself again? And sometimes the answer is rest. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's connecting with someone who allows you to be completely unfiltered. But the key is giving yourself permission to honor that without rushing past it. Because being able to be on like that is a strength. It's a skill. It's part of what allows you to step into opportunities, to lead, to connect, to grow, to build relationships. And it's something to be proud of, but it should never come at the cost of losing access to the version of you that fuels all of that in the first place. The goal isn't to eliminate that public-facing version of yourself. It's to create a rhythm where you can step into it fully when needed, and then just as intentionally step out of it when it's time to come back home to yourself. Because the creativity, the depth, the honesty, the part of you that actually makes everything else meaningful, that doesn't live in a performance, it lives in the quiet spaces where you're not trying to be anything at all. So if you're like me and you're coming off of a stretch of being on, or maybe you're in the middle of one right now, I want you to shift the question from what's next to something a little more grounding. What would help me come back to me? And you may not have the answer. I don't know that I do. But without overthinking it or turning it into another task, figure it out and give yourself permission to follow that. Because the most sustainable version of success isn't the one where you can stay on the longest. It's the one where you know exactly how to return to yourself when it's over. Thank you for listening to Creative Imperfections. Always remember, there's magic in the mess. If you enjoyed this episode, share it, subscribe, and keep showing up for your beautifully imperfect journey. Until next time.